Greetings, viewers. I'm Victor Crimson, and welcome once again to Tormented Tales, where we consider those stories that skirt the edges of our known realities and show us tiny glimpses of the things that lurk beyond. Tonight's couplet of skin crawlers both come from the state of Maryland and center around strange constructions found somewhere out in the deeper forests. Before we get to our cabin in the woods stories, however, just a quick reminder to like and subscribe to Tormented Tales so that you don't miss an episode. And if you happen to have your own true tale of terror just waiting to be shared with the public, then be sure to drop us a line at the address in the description. Now, on to our stories, the first of which comes from Dale in Maryland, and may make you think twice before knocking where you have not been invited. Shackles. Sometimes you don't need someone to tell you every detail for you to be able to form a story. Sometimes, given a few clues and a few specifics, you can put the story together for yourself. When Georgie and I found that cabin in the woods, that's exactly what we did. We took the few pieces of evidence we could find and formed an idea of what might have happened. I'm sure if I tell you what we found, and the details later added by the police, you'll form your own story too. We found it out in the Pine Barrens, and I knew from the moment I saw it that it was an evil place. It wasn't so much the look of the cabin itself, but where it was that made me suspicious. I remember noticing the first time I saw it that there were no paths leading up to the place, and that the area around it had clearly not been disturbed for some time. It almost looked as if it had grown there, like the trees that surrounded it, sprouting up from the ground and forming into that dark, solid shape. Like I said though, it wasn't so much the cabin itself that made me uneasy, but the fact that it was where it was, out in the middle of nowhere, miles from the road, and importantly, from prying eyes. As far as I'm concerned, you only build a cabin that far out if you're specifically looking for some serious privacy. The kind of privacy you need when you definitely don't want people to come knocking. The kind that's craved by hermits, recluses, and very bad people when they're doing very bad things. I should say at this point that the reason I was out that far was for my job. The company I worked for at the time was essentially a logging concern, specializing in pine. Of course, in that particular part of Maryland, pine wasn't exactly hard to find, but we had our restrictions. We could only cut in certain specially designated areas, which we would get to using GPS locators to prevent ourselves from getting lost. Once we found the patch where it was okay to cut, we would clear the entire area one tree at a time until an enormous patch, like a big flat rectangle, was cut into the forest. Our quota, in terms of pay, was based on an average of the number of trees per square foot, so the presence of a cabin in those woods was a problem for several reasons. Firstly, the space taken up by the cabin meant that our quota would be lower because obviously there were no trees growing on the patch where the cabin was. Secondly, the fact that someone might live there meant that we had to check before we cut down anything in the surrounding area. Thirdly, there were the less savory concerns I've already mentioned about why the cabin, not highlighted on any maps or plans, was there at all. I remember when we stumbled across the thing we had been cutting for a few good hours. The sun was beginning to set, and we were basically looking to see which patch we were to start work on the next day. We walked a few hundred yards from where we had been cutting, and there it was, sitting there in a clearing. Since it looked like there was nobody inside, and it did not look like anyone had visited for a while, we decided it would be okay to force the door with our shoulders to see what was inside. 3 hours later, we were still standing outside, though by that point, the place was swarming with police. I will tell you about the things we found in the order that we found them. I think by doing that, you'll be able to build the story for yourself. There was no furniture inside, but studded along the interior walls at around 3 feet from the floor were dozens of solid brass rings, of the kind you might find in the stable, and to which you could tie a horse's bridle. These rings were fixed to the walls themselves with bolts, but rather than having rings or bridles attached, they had chains. Long, rusted chains that stretched over the floor like the coils of some great rusted snake. On the end of every chain there were shackles, In some cases, there were cuffs, clearly meant for wrists. On another's, ankle shackles, and in at least 2 other places, clamps intended to be fixed around the neck. Along the walls above these chains, mounted as if in display, were tools of the kind you might find a blacksmith using for metalwork. Multiple pairs of huge pliers, oversized brass scissors, pokers, pronged forks, and other sharp objects, some of which I don't even know how to describe. Without going into too much detail, I will add that the cuffs, shackles, and neck clamps were all far too small to have been used by an adult. By this point, you may have already begun to put a story together, some narrative covering what kind of a man might need such tools, why he might need them in a cabin deep in the woods, and who he was using them on. It's the final detail, however, that changes the story entirely. There were remains found in that cabin, though not the remains of children. The skeleton, partially covered by decades of fallen leaves, belonged to a fully grown man. His skull had been smashed, most likely by one of the metal tools he had so proudly hung on the walls. Who delivered this fatal blow might have remained a mystery were it not for the fact that the skeleton itself showed other signs of damage. No more blunt trauma inflicted by metal objects, but a different kind of injury. Damage that at first glance neither I nor Georgie had noticed. The damage was teeth marks, grooves and ridges cut right into the bone by mouths that stripped and tore the meat from them. Mouths that, according to what the police told us later, were filled with milk teeth. Where the owners of these mouths escaped to, we will never know, nor will we know how they escaped their chains. One theory that Georgie suspected was that the poor wretches were starved to such an extent that their limbs became far thinner than they had been at the start, so thin in fact that they were able to slip from their bonds and take revenge on the one who had put them there. It would certainly explain how they got away from shackles that were still locked, and also why, when they did escape, they were all so very hungry. I don't know why, but for some reason Dale's story gave me an appetite. An appetite for another story, that is. Our second tale of terror comes from Wally, also from Maryland, who found something very disturbing out there in the Pine Barrens. Though, as I'm sure you'll agree, he made the right decision in the end. The Lost Place. The Barrens, my grandfather always used to say, are a good place to put things you like to be forgotten. For those who have never seen or been into the area in Maryland, known as the Pine Barrens, I'd advise looking it up on Google so that you have some idea of what I'm talking about. After even a quick glance, it should be obvious that they have that name for a reason. Whilst the land isn't literally barren, there are thousands upon thousands of trees. Those trees are all you will find. There is literally nothing else for miles. Row upon row of them, all of them looking exactly the same and stretching away in every direction as far as the eye can see. Mile upon mile of thin, uniform trunks, sparse leaves, and nothing else. The thing about the Barrens is that they don't look all that intimidating from the outside. That's what makes them dangerous. Every year there are reports of people who get lost, go missing, or disappear completely in the Barrens. With no landmarks to get your bearings, you can get lost in under 5 minutes and spend the rest of your life walking in circles in an attempt to get back out before you eventually freeze or starve to death. An easy place to get lost and to put things you're hoping to lose. I heard for years about the supposed lost cabin in the woods. The legend back in town was that an old hermit had built the cabin centuries ago and had lived in it for decades. One snowy day he had set off from the cabin to hunt and had managed to get turned around in the Barrens. Hopelessly lost, he had been unable to find the cabin and had instead wandered into town, shouting about the cabin and crying that he could not remember how to find it again. The story was meant as a warning to children, reminding them that even someone who lived in the woods could become disoriented by them. But over the years it developed into something else, as local kids focused not on the intended moral of the story, but on the tantalizing promise of a lost cabin somewhere in the Barrens. What I was doing in the woods when I stumbled across the cabin is not important. What I found there is. Seeing the structure amongst the trees, my first thought was that it looked less like a lost cabin and more like a cabin that someone had made lost, a thing that someone had chosen deliberately to abandon. That was my first instinct, and an instinct I perhaps should have followed. The frame above the door, I noticed instantly, had been painted with a haphazard splash of red. Seeing it made me think about how the Israelites marked their doors with lamb's blood so the angel of death would pass over and leave them untouched. It also made me think of houses marked out as infected during the plague, houses marked with signs as places not to be entered. That the cabin was empty was obvious. The front door was partially submerged at the base with a slanting heap of soil and detritus piled up in front of it over many years. Clearly someone had made the decision to close that door one day and to never open it again. I made the opposite decision. With some effort, I kicked back the soil and, pulling with all my might against the wooden slats, eventually managed to get the door open. Inside, the cabin was empty, or so I thought at first. The room was simply square, made of vertical poles that had been driven into the ground to make them stand upright. In each corner of this square was a larger, thicker pole that, like the outside door, had been splashed with red. On each of these red poles, carved into the wood itself, was a name: Elizabeth Dern, Matthew Langford, John Weissman, Anne Ford. It was only as I read those names and allowed my eyes to follow the poles down into the corners that I realized. In each corner of the cabin, stretching diagonally towards the center, was a pit, a recess in the earth around 4 or 5 feet long, a grave left open and unfilled, but shielded from the elements by the cabin itself. Were these pillars in the corners of the room meant as headstones, markers for where the deceased had been buried? Walking to the pit in the top left corner, I cautiously looked into the space and saw not only that there was a full human skeleton inside, but that the pole, the long pine trunk bearing the deceased's name, ran not only into the grave itself, but through the remains. The stake had been driven deliberately through the skull's open mouth. It was the exact same in the other 3 graves. In the 4th, the grave of Anne Ford, the skeleton itself was pinned in place by nails and chains, as if someone feared the corpse would somehow escape after death. There was something else about that skeleton. Whilst it was clearly a human being, the skull seemed somehow elongated, as if in the front, instead of a nose, the face would have sharpened into more of a muzzle or snout. The teeth too were notable, for even as they stretched back, partially broken by the stake driven through the jawbones, you could see that the teeth themselves were extraordinarily long. In total, the skull of Anne Ford looked more like the skull of a baboon than that of a person. I left the cabin and headed back to town. The next day I reported what I'd found to the local police. The officer took my report, listened to my story, and as I related the details, went literally as white as a sheet. Leaving the room, he returned a few minutes later with 2 sheets of paper, information he'd printed from the internet that he wanted me to read. The first piece explained that Anne Ford had been executed by hanging in 1679. She was accused of killing 7 people, including her own husband and 3 children. Alongside this information was a short note detailing that Anne was originally buried at a site somewhere in the Barrens outside of the town, but that her body was exhumed in May of 1680 and moved to a second location referred to only as the Lost Place, because she did not lie at rest in her grave. That would explain the chains, I thought. The second piece was a curious bit of history, explaining how, for many years, officials in this part of the world would bury criminals they did not think deserved to be interred on consecrated ground, out in the Barrens and as far from the town as possible. There was a particular section at the bottom of the page explaining how, in certain cases, graves were left open and wooden stakes driven into the mouths of the dead, with the intention of pinning them in place, preventing them from rising again. The practice, the article explained, was reserved for those that the officials suspected of being vampires. When I asked what would be done about the 3 bodies still up in the cabin, the officer explained that such a historical discovery would be referred to an archaeological pathologist, and that in all likelihood the bodies would be exhumed moved to the local churchyard, and given a proper, respectful burial. I suppose if I were less superstitious, I would have helped. I would have allowed these poor souls, wrongly accused centuries ago, to finally have a dignified burial. But I didn't. Hearing that the bodies would be moved, the charms and safeguards removed, I suddenly developed a case of acute amnesia. I could not, for the life of me, remember exactly where the cabin had been, and was unable to lead the officers to it. Of course, in reality, I knew exactly where it was. I simply decided that some things, once forgotten, should probably stay that way. And there you have it. I wonder, would you have allowed the authorities to move those bodies? Or would you have preferred to leave them where they were, safely stored away from others? That's all for tonight. Remember to hit that subscribe button, and I will see you next time when we'll be back with more tales of the truly terrifying and the terrifyingly true. Ta-ta for now.